The bank teller refused to serve Amelia James, unaware she owned the very bank he worked for. What started as a routine transaction quickly exposed deep-rooted prejudice, setting the stage for a confrontation that would shock everyone. What happened next defies belief, but let's start at the beginning. Amelia James, an elegant and self-assured black woman in her early 40s, strode into the flagship branch of Union Bank with the kind of presence that turned heads without demanding attention. Her skin glowed with an even tone, and her natural curls framed her face, softened slightly by minimal but expertly applied makeup. Dressed in a sharp-tailored navy blue business suit that hugged her form perfectly, she exuded both authority and sophistication. A delicate gold necklace glinted at her collarbone, a subtle statement of her success. Amelia's leather briefcase, embossed with her initials, swung lightly at her side as her heels clicked against the polished marble floors. She moved with purpose, her posture upright, her chin slightly lifted, exuding confidence without arrogance. Despite her commanding presence, Amelia's reasons for being there weren't immediately obvious. Her demeanor was composed, almost understated, as though she were simply another client completing a routine transaction. Few could have guessed that she was the bank's new owner, having acquired it mere weeks ago as part of her growing financial empire. Yet, Amelia chose not to reveal her identity just yet. She wanted to observe how her staff treated their customers, to witness the dynamics of the branch in action, and to ensure that her vision of excellence extended from the top down. The lobby itself was a mix of modern professionalism and barely concealed chaos. Gleaming steel accents and glass partitions lent the space an air of efficiency, but the lines of impatient customers told a different story. The rhythmic tapping of keyboards, mixed with the low murmur of conversations, punctuated by the occasional rustling of paper. A faint tension seemed to hover in the air, an unspoken pressure that affected both the employees and the clientele. As Amelia scanned the room, her gaze settled on Kenneth Blake, a middle-aged teller seated at the third window from the entrance. His graying hair was neatly combed, but his tired eyes and downturned mouth betrayed a man who had grown weary of his job. He worked methodically, though his movements lacked the energy or warmth of genuine engagement. Kenneth had a reputation among the staff for being meticulous to a fault, but also for treating certain customers differently, a fact Amelia had heard whispers of during her initial meetings with the bank's leadership team. Approaching his window, Amelia offered a polite but neutral smile. "Good afternoon," she began, placing a neatly written check on the counter. Kenneth glanced at her briefly, his blue eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her appearance. There was no flicker of acknowledgement or warmth, only a stiff, practiced tone as he replied, "How can I help you?" The lack of the usual pleasantries, no welcome or "How are you today?" did not escape her notice. "I'd like to withdraw funds from my account," Amelia said evenly, sliding the check toward him. Kenneth picked up the check with 2 fingers, his lips pressing into a thin line as he inspected it. His eyes darted between the amount written on the paper and Amelia, his jaw tightening. Without further examination, he placed the check back on the counter, pushing it toward her as though it were a nuisance. "I'm sorry, but I can't process this. Our policies are very clear," he said, his tone cold and dismissive. Amelia raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, suppressing the flicker of amusement that threatened to show on her face. She recognized this all too familiar dance, the kind of selective enforcement of rules used to gatekeep and discriminate. His phrasing, "our policies," was as much a shield as it was a veiled excuse, and she could feel the undercurrent of bias laced in his words. "Policies?" she asked calmly, tilting her head. "Which policy would that be?" Kenneth's face stiffened further, and his refusal to meet her gaze was telling. He cleared his throat and added tersely, "If you'd like, you can speak with the branch manager." Amelia's lips curved into a subtle smile. This was exactly the kind of scenario she had anticipated, precisely why she had chosen to come here today. Kenneth Blake, so quick to dismiss her, had no idea who he was talking to. As she glanced around the room, she noted the growing number of customers now watching the exchange, their curiosity piqued. One elderly man, standing nearby, frowned and whispered audibly, "That's strange. I just saw him approve a similar check not 5 minutes ago." Kenneth shifted in his seat, his discomfort beginning to show. But Amelia remained poised. This was no longer just a personal experience. It was a moment of reckoning, not only for Kenneth, but for the culture of the bank itself. And Amelia was ready to hold them accountable. Amelia kept her expression neutral, her voice steady. "Could you explain why you're refusing to process my request?" she asked, her words laced with quiet authority. Though her tone was polite, there was a steeliness in her gaze that hinted at the deeper layers of the conversation. Kenneth barely glanced at her, instead pretending to scrutinize the check he had already dismissed. "You don't have sufficient funds to complete this transaction," he said, his voice sharp and dripping with condescension. He slid the check back toward her with a dismissive flick of his fingers. Amelia remained silent for a beat, carefully observing him. The way he refused to meet her eyes, the slight curl of his lip, his disdain was palpable. His excuse was flimsy at best. She had made no mention of the amount in her account, and she knew for a fact it far exceeded the check's value. It was clear that Kenneth wasn't dealing with numbers. He was dealing with assumptions. Around them, the subtle hum of the bank began to shift. A few customers in line had noticed the exchange and paused their conversations, their curiosity piqued by the tension brewing at Kenneth's window. A middle-aged woman whispered to the person next to her, their furtive glances darting between Kenneth and Amelia. Then, breaking the growing silence, an elderly man stepped forward from the line. His voice was steady, his tone calm but firm as he said, "That's strange. I just saw him process a check like that for someone else. No questions asked." The statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. A few heads turned, some murmurs rippling through the small crowd. The man's quiet challenge seemed to rattle Kenneth, whose face flushed crimson. His composure faltered for a split second before he stiffened, his shoulders pulling back defensively. "This is none of your business," Kenneth snapped, his voice slightly raised. "If you have an issue, ma'am, you're welcome to speak with the manager." His irritation was clear, and his movements became hurried, almost clumsy, as he shifted papers on his desk. Amelia studied him, unbothered by his growing discomfort. She let the moment stretch, watching as the weight of the stares from customers and staff began to bear down on him. Finally, her gaze dropped to his name tag, Kenneth Blake. She made a mental note, her calm demeanor never wavering. Without another word, Amelia turned and walked toward the manager's office, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors. Kenneth, rattled and flushed, glared at her retreating figure, his frustration evident. Little did he know, his day was about to take a turn he'd never forget. Amelia raised her hand slightly, signaling for the branch manager. A well-dressed man emerged from an office at the back of the bank. The moment he saw Amelia, his face paled. "Ms. James, we weren't expecting you today. Is there an issue?" he asked nervously. Kenneth froze, confusion written across his face as whispers rippled through the lobby. All eyes were now on Amelia and the manager. "Yes, there is an issue," Amelia said, her voice steady. She gestured toward Kenneth. "This employee just refused to serve me and cited non-existent policies. Would you care to explain?" The manager fumbled for words while Kenneth's expression turned to one of dawning realization. "Ma'am, I didn't know. Please accept my apology," Kenneth stammered, his confidence crumbling. Amelia ignored his apology, instead addressing the gathered customers. "As the new owner of this bank, I assure you this behavior will not be tolerated. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect and fairness." The next day, Amelia held a meeting with all the employees of the branch. Standing at the head of the room, she introduced herself formally as the bank's new owner and made her stance clear. Discriminatory practices would no longer have a place in Union Bank. Kenneth was temporarily suspended and required to complete mandatory training on bias and customer service. News of the incident quickly spread across social media, with many praising Amelia for her composure and decisive action. She didn't stop there. Amelia launched a company-wide initiative to implement diversity and inclusion training for all employees, aiming to transform the bank's culture. For Amelia, This wasn't just about one man's prejudice. It was a step toward dismantling systemic inequities in corporate spaces. Her calm yet firm approach sent a powerful message. Accountability and change are possible, even in the face of deeply ingrained bias.